A reading from the life of Jesus as told by Luke. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened.
Well, hey, how y'all doing today? We are glad you're here. My name is Ed. I'm one of the pastors here at Community Christian, and we're really thankful you gave time to come and be a part of this, and we hope it's a blessing to you today. I'll tell you about an experience, and I've had this experience. It may just be a Christian experience. Maybe it's my experience and you can't relate, but if you're not a Christian, maybe you won't understand this, but you'll get a little insight into our world a little bit. Imagine that you had a pretty tough week. Now, it's not the over-the-top worst week you've ever had. It's the kind of week where, you had a little bit of car trouble. You didn't feel too good because the weather in Georgia decided to pretend it was Michigan. And, your head just exploded with the barometer and all of that kind of stuff. And then you got kids and you argued with your teenager all week long, or if you're the teenager, you argued with your parents all week long. And I call that kind of week, and I've always said to people, I'm just a quarter turn off. I'm not straight up and down. It's not the worst thing, but I woke up wrong. I'm just off a little bit, and everything seems to irritate me. Now, I've learned through my time of doing life wrong, to be honest, that anything that is inside of me that's troubling me, I can't keep that kind of stuff to myself. It becomes toxic to me. I need to say it to somebody. I need to ask other people to sort of help me really just listen sometimes. And one of the benefits that I have as a follower of Christ is we have small groups. And I'm in a small group, and one of the benefits of that is I know that when it comes time for my small group, I'm going to get a chance to say, hey, I've had it's not a worse week, but I've had this. They're going to all go, oh, and it helps. So you show up at small group, you jump online, you get on the Google Meet or whatever it is, you're in person, and they start going around the group, and the first person tells about their week. It's not too bad, but then the second person, they tell, we just found out that my 30-year-old daughter, she has cancer, and she's going to have a double mastectomy, and you go, oh, that's bad. And so everybody's like, they don't just say, aw, people ask questions. And everybody sort of leans in. Then the next person tells about, hey, we weren't here 2 weeks ago because our son had a terrible accident and he's going to be paralyzed for life. And you're like, oh, I can't say what I was going to say when they get to me. And you can't share. You can't say it because it's not that big a deal. But in your mind, you're a little bit ticked off. You're just a little hacked that you can't say it out loud because what you want to say is, When is somebody going to think about me? When are they going to look at me? And if you're not real careful, you can imagine that nobody really cares that even if you did share it, because it's so little, even though it really matters to you, nobody would notice. Now, I brought that up because I can imagine that the lady you just heard about at the beginning of this scripture with Jesus, she sort of felt this way. She has a problem, but it's a chronic problem. It's a 12-year problem. It's just been going for a long time. And maybe she did share it at the beginning, and nothing really changed. And people said, oh, and it felt better, but you can't just bring it up forever. And nothing gets better. And over time, if you're not careful, you begin to think that because I can't say it out loud to anybody, and because it's not that big a deal, not only do people not really want to hear about my problem, but God doesn't really care about my problem either. God doesn't really notice my problem. It's not as big as the other problems. And the reason I say this woman might feel this way is she's in a crowd and a really big deal is happening. There's a kid about to die and the whole crowd is going with Jesus to go watch him, see what's going to happen with this dying girl. And she knows she has a problem and Jesus could take care of it, but it ain't like a kid's dying. I mean, it ain't as monumental as that. Now, before we get to the rest of the scripture, I just want to say to you, for those of you who are new around here and you may not know, what you've wandered into is a collection of moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and neighbors and friends and people that we know and people we don't know. But for the large part, at the core of this group of people you're sitting in, we are Jesus people. And what I mean by that is that we don't come just because Jesus is an addition to our life. Jesus is like the focus of our lives. We say that we're followers of Jesus, and what we mean by that is Jesus not only gives us purpose for our lives, Jesus is the purpose of our life. He doesn't just center us up and give us a place to stand. He becomes the center of our life. He is the purpose of that. And so at the beginning of every year for the last several years, in fact, this really started in the middle of the pandemic when we realized our whole world had sort of decided to divide into camps and yell at each other about all. Remember when you yell at people about whether they had a mask on or not? Remember when people were crazy over toilet paper and somebody stole it all and you didn't get any? And everybody just went to corners and argued over everything. And we began to say, because it happened in the church too. And we decided, hey, we want to focus on what is central, and what we finally got to that is central is Jesus is what's central at Community Christian. Jesus is at the heart of everything we do, so that at the start of every year, we go through the biographies of Jesus, and we try to draw everybody's attention back to what is central, is that we are Jesus people. And this year, what we're doing is we're not just going through one of the 4 biographies of Jesus, we're looking at this run-through thread that Jesus talks about, that the nature of his kingdom is that his kingdom is really simple. He has a very simple kingdom. And what I mean by that is that even though Jesus came to do the most important thing that ever happened, that he was going to redeem people like me and you who didn't have a way to get to God, he was going to make a way that people could get to God. He came to seek and to save everything that was lost. And that he accomplished that, and that Jesus is actively at work right now to find everything that's lost, and through what he is doing in the world, he's reclaiming the whole world, and all of broken creation will be recreated through his kingdom. That's a big thing. But the way Jesus described that this big thing would take place is, he said, it's going to take place like a woman that has a huge ball of dough, and inside of the ball of dough is a tiny little bit of yeast. And nobody ever tastes the bread when it's made and goes, man, that was good yeast. What they taste is the bread, he said, but the yeast is what affected the whole thing. He said one day people are going to look at the world and the birds of the air are going to come nest, and all of creation is going to be affected by my kingdom. But it's the kingdom that's a simple little thing inside of it. He said it's like a guy who goes out and just throws seed out indiscriminately, so that the kingdom can just grow And even though he had a great big job, Jesus, even when he was on the earth, wasn't about the big and the impressive. He was about the simple. Now, he noticed things that, well, frankly, nobody else seemed to notice. I mean, he's a king of kings and all, but he didn't live like everybody else. He lived homeless. He had an important mission, but he didn't call important people to be with him. He called together some blue-collar fishermen and some people who had been outcast from the other positions that people in society didn't even like to be around them. He has this collection of tax collectors and sinners and fishermen and outcasts, and they're the ones that he's going to work through. And even though large crowds come to follow Jesus and important people were drawn to him, they didn't get on the inside because he was working in small ways, which is where this story begins today. Jesus is getting off a boat. I'll draw you back to that's where the story starts. He's getting off a boat, and there's a crowd waiting on him. Now, the truth is, if we took a few verses back, Jesus is on the boat because he had gone across the lake, and he had healed a guy who was full of demons, and that guy had been outcast for society, so nobody had to look at him. Jesus heals him, and on that side, when he heals the guy that's full of demons, a crowd comes, and Jesus goes, I need to get away from the crowd. So he goes across the Sea of Galilee. Back up a few verses, the reason he's over here with the demon is he had fed a bunch of people on this side of the lake, and he wanted to get away from that crowd, so he goes over here and he heals a demon-possessed guy. That draws a crowd, and he goes over here, and the original crowd has walked around trying to get to him, and they're waiting on him. And when he gets there, there's this guy there. Just this one guy is what we hear about. There's a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader. He came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house. Now, I don't want you to miss all the significance of that for a little bit, because Jairus is a synagogue leader, and what you hear is like a pastor. But because their nation is a religious nation, every town is centered around the synagogue. So the synagogue isn't just a religious facility. It's like the civic center. Everything in the town runs through the synagogue. And so Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, is an elected position. He's an important person. He's probably popular, he wouldn't got elected. And because of the connections that he's had, most likely he's become sort of a wealthy guy. He's well known, he's well liked. He has all kinds of power. He's built his life well. He's done everything he can do. And now this important, accomplished man is doing what no Jewish man in their day would ever find himself doing in public. It says, he falls before Jesus and kneels before him in humility. And Luke tells us why. Because his only daughter, a girl about 12, was dying. So Jairus has money, he has success, all the people in town like him. His whole life he's worked hard to get everything around him so he can do whatever he needs to do when he needs to do it. And then there comes a moment in his life where there's only one thing that matters to him, and he can't do nothing about it. He cannot fix it. He cannot change it. And his whole life now, he just lays before Jesus. You know, maybe you know what that's like. Maybe you know what it's like to come to a place and you've worked really hard to get everything where you want it to be, and you thought everything was where it should be, and you've pursued the right things, and you've done good things, and then all of a sudden, something happens. Cancer happens. Or an accident happens and your child's paralyzed. Or somebody you know and love makes a stupid decision. And it affects everything and everybody. And you'd give anything to change the situation with everything you've done with your life. and you can do nothing. And so you find yourself before Jesus. Now, I just want to say to everybody, if you've ever been in that place, or you're in that place right now, there is no shame in that you came to Jesus because you didn't have any other choice. It's one of the untold things that we don't say a lot. Most people come to God because they don't have another choice. We like to think that churches are full of people because one day everybody woke up and goes, you know what I want to do? I want to go to church. You know what brings most people to church? Something went wrong. Something got off track. You found your life, the way you wanted to manage it, you couldn't manage it anymore. And you didn't know what else to do, so you turned to God. I don't know if that's true about you, but I can tell you that's where Jairus is. He's at the feet of Jesus. He's heard what Jesus can do. He ain't sure he believes that Jesus is everything everybody says he is. But when it's your daughter, you take your shot. You don't have to believe everything everybody else believes. When it's your only shot, you take the shot. You do whatever you can. I mean, there's certainly nothing more important for him than to say, Jesus, would you come to my house, my daughter? And Jesus has compassion on him. And so here Jesus goes. It's him and Jairus and all these important people surrounding Jairus who've known him. And the whole crowd now, because Jesus says he's going to go with Jairus, the whole crowd is following him. And in the middle of this crowd is this woman who had tried to get close to Jesus because she had a 12-year problem, but nobody notices her. And certainly she's not as important to anybody as the kid who's dying. She's somebody nobody in the crowd notices or cares about or thinks about except the God who is walking in her midst.
As Jesus and Jairus hurry off to his daughter, Luke tells us, as Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. Now, Luke seems to draw some interesting comparisons between Jairus and this woman in the crowd. First, Luke tells us that Jairus' daughter is 12 years old, and that this woman has been bleeding for 12 years of her life. Now, most likely, this bleeding is an internal hemorrhage that the ancient doctors couldn't do anything about. She was in constant pain and emotional anguish. On top of that, because of the Jewish religious law at the time, her constant bleeding would have kept her in a state of being ceremonially unclean. She was not able to go into the temple or synagogue to worship with God's people, and most likely, she was a social outcast. Jairus was an important synagogue leader. He was a somebody. This woman isn't even given a name, and she is rejected by everyone. She's a nobody. The entire town is heading off to see what Jesus can do for Jairus' 12-year-old daughter, but no one even remembers that there's a woman in the town who has been bleeding for 12 years. She's insignificant to them. But when Jesus is nearby, she and Jairus stand on equal ground. So Luke tells us that when this woman saw Jesus in the crowd, she came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Now, one other writer of Jesus' life, Mark, gives us a little more insight into what this woman is thinking. Mark tells us, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her whole body that she was freed from her suffering. Now, I find this woman's faith interesting, because it seems a little superstitious. She seems to have heard about Jesus and his healings before, and she seems to think, I just need to be near him. Even if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. As if clothes were themselves are magical. Now, in fairness, Jairus also seems to think that Jesus has to be near his daughter to heal her. Mark tells us that Jairus even asked Jesus to lay his hands on his daughter. They don't know how the healing works, but they know it has something to do with Jesus. But what I find interesting is that God doesn't penalize them for their lack of knowledge. He rewards them for putting their trust in Jesus. So when the woman touches Jesus' clothes, she's instantly healed. And Jesus seems to know it happened, but he doesn't know who it was. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." Peter and the disciples are confused. "What do you mean, who touched you? We're surrounded by people. Everyone is touching you." Which, by the way, is further proof that the clothes aren't magical, because all of them weren't getting healed. This woman was healed because she trusted Jesus to heal her. But the disciples don't notice her, because she's a nobody. And because they have big and important plans, they have to go and save Jairus' daughter. But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that the power has gone from me." Which, I don't know what that means. Does Jesus have a video game health bar that when she touched him, Jesus noticed it got depleted? Probably not, but that would be cool. Luke goes on. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, which must have been new for her because she must have been used to being unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Now I want you to notice what Jesus says here to this woman who no one noticed, to this nobody that this town had ignored and neglected. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." He calls her daughter. Notice that comparison. Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' daughter, but on the way he encounters another daughter of God. She's a nobody to everybody else. Luke doesn't give her a name, but to Jesus, her name is daughter. You belong to me, and though your faith might have been small, though you might not have all the right theological doctrines memorized, your faith has healed you. Because your faith, your trust was in the one who sees you, the one who notices you, the one who loves you.
Maybe you can relate to this woman, and you thought at times you're in the middle of a difficult situation and you wonder, you really begin to think, does anybody know the pain I'm in? I'm trying to put up a good front, but does anybody know? Or maybe you know they know. You know they know what's going on. And nobody asks you about it. Nobody talks to you. And you begin to wonder, do they not care? Is nobody interested? Maybe you even begin to wonder, well, since they don't care, does God care? One of the things I hope all of you will walk away really clearly with from this story is that this account from the life of Jesus is God's great big yes to you and say, I care. I see. You're not alone. You're not unseen. Your problem is not unknown. I know what's going on in your circumstance. I know what's happening in your family, and I am up to something for your good and God's glory. And it really is okay if your faith is small. It really is okay if you get angry. It really is okay if you even get to the point that you accuse God and you wonder why, and you wonder where, and you wonder where He is and what He's doing. Because if you wrestle with God, at least you're with God. You haven't walked away from God. And God will hold you very close as you wrestle. And even if your faith gets small and all you have is just a little bit of faith to question God, it does not matter how big your faith is. In our world, people talk about it's the amount of faith that I've got to get my faith to a certain size before God could move. Your faith, the size of it doesn't matter. It's who you put your faith in. If you take a little faith and put it in Jesus, Jesus is powerful. And a little faith with Jesus can accomplish a lot. And a lot of faith in you will just to make a great big swelled up ego of you. But faith in Him, it can change things. Your faith can be simple and small, like a little bitty mustard seed. And as long as your faith is in a God who can change things, His faithfulness is greater than you can possibly imagine. And I can imagine in this story, Jairus watches this account of He watches Jesus interact with this woman. I mean, after all, it's Jairus that goes out of his way to fall on his face before Jesus. It's Jairus who's humbled himself. The woman just reaches out and touches Jesus. It's Jairus who brings the attention to himself and says, I need you, come with me. And when Jesus stops, I'm sure he's thinking, Jesus, come on, let's go. My daughter. What I know is that while Jesus is still speaking to the woman, Luke tells us that someone came and said to Jairus, your daughter's dead. You don't need to bother the teacher anymore. Now we know because they had to walk everywhere, the truth is that by the time Jairus had left home to go get Jesus, by the time they start back and this guy finds out she's dead, probably the daughter had been dead the whole time. I mean, probably when he first said it to Jesus, she's already dead. And in a moment when shock hits you or grief begins to overtake you, you don't know why you're in the mess that you're in, you wind up saying things and it often jumps to blame others. And I'm not saying Jairus thought all of these things, but I can tell you this is what I would have thought. I would have thought to myself, Jesus, you could have come back for her. You could have dealt with her later. Why didn't you just do what I wanted you to do? Why didn't you move when I asked you to move? I don't know that he thought that, but Jesus, who notices everything, he turns to Jairus and he says, Jairus, don't be afraid. You believe. Just believe, Jairus, and she'll be healed. And I don't know how much faith Jairus has left. It can't be a lot. But I'll remind you, Jesus doesn't need a lot of faith. He just needs you to trust him. And so they go. We're told when they arrived at the house, Jesus didn't let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. Stop wailing, Jesus said. She's not dead, she's asleep. They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. Now, that's quite a shocking change of emotion. I mean, they're weeping and wailing, it says, and then all of a sudden they're mocking Jesus, saying, he thinks she's only asleep, and they knew she was dead. Now, I just want to be clear for those of you who want to think what Luke is actually saying is they were wrong, and they didn't really know. She really was just asleep, and Jesus was just going to go in and shake her and wake her up. They knew what dead was. Way more than most of us in this room who've never been around a dead body, who've never seen anybody who was dead. Ancient people were around dead bodies all the time. Most women in their day had more children that were dead than were alive. Because it was tough to get a child to adulthood. So many tragedies around. When they said she was dead, they knew she was dead. And it's remarkable that it's not any different for them than it is for us. I don't know what situation you've ever been in where your mind begins to worry. Have you noticed that when you begin to worry, you become a prophet about the future? Oh, I know. Oh, I know that if I do this, this is going to happen. Oh, I know if I say that. I know my marriage is dead. I know there is no hope of me keeping this relationship with my kids. It's dead. I know my sobriety's dead. I know this is dead. I know it'll never change. It's all dead. But for the follower of Christ, we often forget that we serve someone who loves raising dead things. It may really be dead, but he has the power to change that. Jesus doesn't care what you know. What he cares is your faith in him? Even if you only have a tiny little bit of trust, just a little bit of trust is enough. If you just take one step toward him, his way, just enough to talk to him, just enough to wrestle with him, just enough to tell him what's going on, just enough to stop trying to control what's next and what you know needs to take place and how you know it needs to work out. He will do what is best in the situation. Luke tells us that the crowds laughed at him, but he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. And then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anybody what had happened. Now, I bet that's the hardest command they ever got from anybody. I'll tell you this, if Jesus had told me not to tell anybody that he had healed my daughter, I'd have had to ask forgiveness 1,000 times. I could not have kept that to myself. But here's the point that Luke is making. Nothing's impossible for Jesus. Nothing. And though you might be in a situation that feels impossible, and though you don't get to determine what the outcome that Jesus sees that needs to take place, and though you can't imagine anything good coming out of the situation you're in, you have to stop focusing on what you know the future looks like and focus on who you trust for the future. Because if you're a believer, you serve a God who sees every part of your life and knows every hurt in your life. And no matter how small and insignificant it is, and no matter how much no one else wants to deal with it, He has the power to deal with what's going on in your life. So before we move on, I want to give us a moment to feel seen and noticed before God. And Jason's going to come and lead us in that time.
When you're in the midst of some difficult or painful or uncertain times in your life, it can be really incredibly isolating. And you ask those questions that we've been wrestling with today. Does anybody see? Does anybody care? And for us as Jesus people, there's this thing we often do is intellectually, we know in our minds, yeah, God sees and God cares. But the distance from here to here is so far. It's so hard to get it from your brain and what you know intellectually to what you feel deep down in the heart of your soul. And see, that's one of the reasons why God gave us His church, each other. Brothers and sisters, who, can I remind you, have the Spirit of God living within us. We have the ability to speak truth to one another. We have the ability to wrap arms around each other and look upon each other, look in each other's eyes with love and compassion, the love and compassion that comes from Him. And in one another, we see and feel and get it way down deep in our souls that He cares and He does see. So this morning, we want to be that for one another. We want to be these expressions of God's love to one another. And so as we often do in our community, we're going to gather together in little groups of 3 or 4, and we're just going to simply share our names together and then talk about one thing that you may need prayer for this week. And as people listen and as we agree to carry each other in prayer this week, our hope is that you might feel God's loving care that would lift you up and remind you that He's here with you, He sees you, He's listening to your prayers, and He cares about your life. And for those of you who this feels strange and you're not sure you want to participate, you don't have to. Nobody's going to make you do anything. I would encourage you, though, to try. Participate in whatever way you feel like you can at your own level. Nobody's going to ask you to pray or say anything if you don't want to. You can just sit and listen. But after we've had a time to share together, the band's going to come and they're going to sing a song to us written from the perspective of the woman in this story today. This is a song reminding us of who God is and who God was to her. So go ahead, find 3 or 4 people around you, gather up, and let's share together ways we can pray for one another.
He sees, He notices every part of life, even the parts you feel are too small or too insignificant or too private to bring up in a prayer group. He cares. And if you trust him, even if you just trust him enough to say it to someone, you don't get to decide what he does. You don't get to decide what happens in the future. But if you trust him, he will take what is ugly and terrible and dead, and he can make it beautiful. But as we wrap up, I don't want to end this whole thing today by talking about us and our problems and where we are. I want to focus on the simple kingdom. The whole point of this series is for those of us who are followers of Christ to begin to notice the way Jesus is at work and the life that he is currently living. Jesus is currently living a life in the 21st century in America, in Sharpsburg. And you can join him. You can be a part of what he's doing in this simple kingdom. You can be at work with him in what he is about in this world. But so often, we're like the disciples and we're looking for Jesus in big, glorious ways of the crowd. We're trying to see what God is doing, and we're ignoring the needs of the woman who's been standing next to us the whole time. We got big, important things that we want to accomplish in our lives and things that we want to do with our lives, and we know how our life and our story is supposed to go, and we miss what God is doing. And the truth is, many of us feel like we've already got so many people in our lives that need us. I don't have time for anybody else. I don't have any space for what Jesus might be doing to the people around me. Or you're one of the people that's in a situation like Jairus or this woman. You're in a terribly difficult season, and your problem is really big, and it consumes you. And you become so consumed with your own troubles that you don't have enough space to notice what God is doing right around you in the moment that can encourage you and help you. But you don't notice because you've turned inward on yourself. One of the things that sociologists have noticed about the culture that we've created over the last 25 years, they're calling our culture the frictionless society. And what they mean by that is that we've all bought into this. The merchandisers and everybody else in technology has provided it, but all of us bought into it, is that we've created a society where I can have my needs met and I can do the things that I want to do, and I don't have to interact with people I don't want to have to deal with the friction of people I don't want to have to deal with. I can just deal with and get what I want in the ways that I want it. I mean, I can go about and get any restaurant to deliver whatever food they have, whatever I want, by DoorDash, so I don't have to deal with that family that won't keep their kid at their own table. I just have my food, what I want, at my house, and it becomes frictionless. I can get groceries or whatever I need delivered to my house. They can come and leave it on my steps. My Ring doorbell will show me that they're there. I don't even have to look at them. And if I do talk to them, it's an unknown voice coming from some light from a doorbell. And I don't have to see anybody. I don't have to deal with anybody. I can just do my thing without interacting. I can get a Peloton. I don't have to go to the gym. I can interact with an image on a screen that will give me commands like they're in charge of my life. I can just interact with things. I can get on Facebook and stalk people and judge them silently instead of having to do it in a crowd. And maybe that's not you. But you know, our town, our place where we live, and I've now lived in Coweta County almost 35 years now. And I was one of the people when I came here 35 years ago that the people who had lived here before goes, oh, those people coming in and ruining our small town. And now everybody else comes in and that's all we hear is our beautiful little small town. And I want to say, what are y'all looking at? We don't live in a small town. We don't live in a place. People talk about protect the rural integrity. That happened a long time ago, people. You want to know what a small town looks like? A small town looks like when you go to the store, you know the people in the store that are waiting on you and the other customers in the store. You not only know them, you know their mom and their dad, you know their grandma, you go to their grandpa, you know where they live, you know. I grew up in a small town. Every time I went to the store, some lady in the store called my mom and told her she saw me in the store. That's a small town. Most of you will go to the restaurant today after we're done, and you won't see anybody you know and you like it. You will go to the same grocery store every week, and you may see people you recognize their face, but you don't know their name, you don't know their story. And the sad part of it is that happens to us over time in a frictionless society is not only do you not know, you do not care. Which isn't a problem for anybody except for followers of Christ, because those nameless people that live around us in our small town, Jesus said their name is neighbor. And you only have one command, which is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the way you demonstrate that to Him is you love your neighbor like you love yourself. And it isn't going to come back by you longing for something that happened in your youth that you imagined, like I described, where people called you. That's not going to get you anywhere except becoming a part of the problem. But what if you joined the move of King Jesus and you began to notice? And you noticed, oh, that lady is in the store every time I shop, and her name is on her shirt. Who knew? And I could say hi to her. And I could talk to her. And who knows, over time, if I began to notice and I began to speak, in my community, in my neighborhood, the whole town won't change, but my circles could change, and I could notice, and I could know a name, and I, as a follower of Christ, I could begin to bring their name and their story before the God of the universe who changes things, and He would begin to do the work of the small kingdom through me. What if that became our attitude? Over the last 5 years ago, I've been challenged by a group that I'm a part of here to live this kind of lifestyle. And I can tell you, it has radically changed my experience of where I live. Not because I've done big things in my neighborhoods, back the way it was in the 1950s. I'm not even sure I want that. I do not want to go back to that. But because I've begun to notice people and know their stories and know their names, and I've begun to do small things with great love. Some things nobody notices but me and Jesus. And the big things that have taken place is He is changing me. The kingdom is coming in my life. And I've started to live with more gratitude and more excitement for life. I'm more aware of the blessings of God. In one of the most difficult seasons of my life, I've realized how near He is to me, how much He is alive, how much He is at work. And even in the difficulty of what's happening in me, it's incredible what He will do through me. And I want that for you. I want you to experience it, because it is the kingdom of God that has come into our midst. It's His simple kingdom at work. And it starts as simply as you noticing. You just start noticing, and you start praying, and God begins to change things. So as we end, I want us to take a moment and draw near to Jesus. And one of the ordinary ways we do every week, in grape juice and bread. And Jason's going to lead us in that.